Hello again, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Mules Rider Chronicles podcast. I'm your host, Craig Marlett, the Mules Rider, and I want to say thanks for joining me today as I share another part of the sometimes crazy journey known as my life. In today's story, I'm going to take you to the late 60s when my brother and I were traveling up and down the East Coast with our rock band playing the nightclub circuit. This story took place on a trip from Florida to the nation's capital, where I got stuck in a little southern town that wasn't quite ready to have a long-haired hippie type show up uninvited to the party. So hop up here on my old mule and get comfortable as we look into the past through this next story, stranded neath the Mason-Dixon line. For several years during the late 60s, I traveled with a band led by a drummer named Pete Middleton. My brother Terry had first met Pete when he was playing in Daytona Beach with a band called A Bit of All Right. They needed a bass player, so Terry auditioned and subsequently joined the group. Before long, they went back to D.C. and he went with them. After a few months, the guitar player also moved on, so I joined the band in Washington and took the job playing guitar. Being with a trio was great fun for me because I always had to be on top of things. When you're only a three-piece band, if anyone drops the ball, you're in trouble. So it kept me on my toes and was a fun time in my life. It was 1967, and Jimi Hendrix was just hitting the music scene big, so it was a great time to be a rock guitar player. It was the beginning of the psychedelic movement, and all that went along with that also became a part of our lives. Our first gig was at a place called Cap'n Guy's. Now, this was a gay bar on New York Avenue in D.C., and though we were straight, it was pretty fun and a real education. The gay liberation movement had not really kicked off yet, and for the most part, homosexuals back then kept anonymity in public life. But when they came to Cap'n Guy's, they didn't mind letting everybody know they were flying high in the big pink sky. I can still remember the shock of seeing my first drag queen with a 5 o'clock shadow and a voice like Jack Webb.
You need a shave, lady.
That kind of thing can shake you up when you're a small-town boy and new to the nation's capital. It was a job for us, though, and as long as they paid on time, we could care less. The people at Cap'n Guy's liked our music and gave big tips for playing requests. I specifically remember one guy who called himself Miss Parsons. He would always ask for Bob Dylan tunes and tip $10 to $20 per request. Of course, he was usually so drunk we could play anything, and as long as we said it was a Bob Dylan song, he didn't seem to notice.
For a $10 trip, I'll try and catch the wind.
I can still hear my brother Terry announcing over the microphone, "Here's another great Bob Dylan request that goes out to Miss Parsons." Then we play something by Otis Redding. It was a crazy way to earn a living, sort of like owning a pay telephone in an insane asylum. We knew it was a madhouse, but we never told them we knew, so they kept putting their dimes in. It was also the year of the Big Mac. Right across the street from Cap'n Guy's was a McDonald's, and for 89 cents you could get a Big Mac, fries, and a Coke. We were really into the Big Mac at that time, and should have been stockholders as much as we spent at that place. From the stage at Cap'n Guy's, I could look out the front door and see the alley that ran alongside the McDonald's. The D.C. sewer rats there were so big, they could actually knock the lids off the garbage cans behind the restaurant. I think they got their Big Macs for free. I saw one once carrying a switchblade knife and smoking a cigarette. Even the local alley cats walked on the other side of the street when those boys were having dinner.
Arr, put down that burger, Puss in Boots.
After the gig, we would sometimes go to a little takeout joint on 14th Street called Wings and Things. We played every night until 2 a.m., and then we would go there to pick up something to eat. It was one of my favorite places because they had come up with a special mambo sauce that made the chicken taste fantastic. The shop was located right in the middle of the black ghetto, but it never bothered me since I knew so many black musicians and got along well with most of them.
Hey, what's up, bro? Give me 5.
It was a year later while playing in Waterville, Maine at a place called the Chez Paris when Pete, Terry, George, and I sat in our hotel room and watched on the news as 14th Street was being burned to the ground. It was April 1968. Someone had shot Dr. Martin Luther King in Memphis, Tennessee, triggering the riots in D.C. that left 1,000 burned-out homes and businesses and 12 people dead.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
After that happened, we started eating at the People's Drug Store just across the bridge into Arlington, Virginia. They had a great sandwich called the Beef'n Burger that was sort of like a Sloppy Joe with a little less sloppy. They were open around the clock, and so was their lunch counter. One night after the gig, we were eating there when 2 men and a woman came in wearing hospital gowns. One of them sat next to me and started drinking all the cream from the coffee creamers.
Hey, save some for me, will ya?
Another was pouring ketchup on the soda crackers and eating them, while the woman was dumping the sugar dispenser onto the counter and lapping it all up like a dog. After a night of playing at Captain Guy's, they seemed pretty normal, so it didn't bother me. For all I knew, they could have been members of Congress or something. I wasn't sure what was happening until the police came in and escorted them out the front door into an awaiting hospital van. They were like 3 little children laughing and having a gay old night on the town. I found out later they had escaped from a mental institution just down the street from People's.
We're morons!
Washington, D.C. was full of good music back then. On any given night, we could go across the street to the little bar where Link Ray played. He was a hero of mine and the original founder of the distorted electric guitar technique. A rock and roll pioneer during the 50s, by 1967 Link had fallen on rough times and was supposedly a heroin addict. He was still a great musician, and some years later he was rediscovered by the world and actually got the recognition he deserved. We would also go over to Georgetown to the Silver Dollar to see and hear the legendary guitarist Roy Buchanan. He was the Mozart of the Fender Telecaster guitar, and the place was always filled with musicians, spellbound by his incredible gift. I remember hearing him play the song Summertime one night, and it sounded like angels sliding up and down the guitar neck, creating sounds I thought must have come from heaven. It was like hearing another person reading my deepest thoughts and playing them on the guitar. Though he had found some success during a brief period of producing several albums, Roy never could get rid of the ghost that haunted him. They found him dead in a jail cell in 1988 from an apparent suicide. When we were on the road, we usually traveled in a car pulling a trailer, unless we happened to have a van or even a hearse or ambulance. One of our best band cars was a big black 1959 Cadillac limousine. That was styling, no doubt, and at 3 gallons for $1, you could go pretty far on very little money, no matter what you were driving. Traveling up and down the East Coast playing nightclubs was a lot of fun in those days, but since Interstate 95 was just being built, we could be on a big highway through one state and a small country road through another. For a carload of hippie types to be traveling through the South in the 60s, there were certain places and things you knew to avoid. The police were not as technologically advanced as they are today, but neither did the legal loopholes currently available to a modern defense lawyer hamstring them. There were certain things that could get you pulled over at the drop of a hat. Things like long hair, bloodshot eyes, a smoke-filled car, or just the look of people having more fun than they should be having. Just the sound of places like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi could make your bell-bottoms tighten up 2 sizes in the crotch if you had any experience, or had heard stories of what others had been through on the prison farms in the South. In those days, you could get caught in the wrong speed trap and never be heard from again.
Boy, you came to the wrong place to drive too fast. I see peanuts in your future.
Hitchhiking was also popular then, though I never liked it that much and preferred a little bit more control of my situation. Being a long-haired hippie-type rock and roll band wasn't just about playing the music, though. We were also part of a social revolution that was going on, and were expected to do our part for others who were in the same club. This meant that picking up hitchhikers was a part of our moral responsibility in a way, especially if they were endowed with a certain hairstyle or dressed in the familiar fashion of the day. Patched jeans, bell-bottoms, vests, long hair, earring, T-shirt with marijuana leaf on the front, puff-sleeve pirate-style shirt or no shirt at all, beetle or dingo boots, leather of any kind, especially suede with strings, and of course, any good-looking girl, no matter how she dressed.
Hop in, cutie. Where you headed?
In 1967, Pete had a beautiful white 55 Ford convertible. It was a real cruiser and a fantastic band car because it had a big enough engine to pull a trailer if need be, but still looked cool with the top down. In a cruiser like that, we could just take off and figure out where we were going on the way. I remember one such trip in 1968. It was the middle of the summer, and Pete and I had just left Florida to go back to Washington, D.C. and find another bass player. My brother had decided to leave the band and had stayed in Orlando. We were somewhere around Ludowici, Georgia, when we spotted another long-haired brother with his thumb out and carrying a guitar over his shoulder. We picked him up and learned that he went by the name Gypsy, which was a common moniker back then for a large number of people, both male and female. After the traditional greetings, we were soon on the road again, headed for D.C. Now, U.S. Highway 301 was a great road for us back then because it always crossed Interstate 95. Wherever there was a patch of it, it was finished. It was also a road where you could find lots of bypasses to avoid going through the small towns whenever possible. We could usually make the trip from Florida to D.C. in about 17 hours, so we would each drive out a tank of gas and then switch drivers. We traveled this route frequently and pretty much knew where everything was and any hot speed traps to avoid. This was important information since we would often have a driver's license from one state and a tag and registration from another. This required a certain finesse when being accosted by the local law officers, and Pete had somewhat mastered this particular skill. In fact, it was worth getting stopped every now and then just to hear him do the routine. Occasionally we'd have to spend the night in jail, but more often than not they bought the story. It was an awesome sight to see a master like Pete at work. Now Gypsy was heading up to New York and hoping to find a gig in some folk singers club in the city. By that time, Bob Dylan had made his big splash, and nearly anyone who could play and sing original stuff was hoping to get a shot in one of the coffee houses in Greenwich Village. Our band was more into the Stones and Hendrix type stuff, so playing in coffee houses was never something we aspired to. By the time we were nearing the North Carolina border, I was getting a bit tired and stopped at Pedro's south of the border to get some food and let Pete take over the driving. We got some burgers, and since my guitar and amp were in the back seat, I crawled into the convertible boot to crash. I was holding the money, so I told him to wake me up when he got gas, and I would pay for the next tank. I could still hear Pete and Gypsy yakking away as I drifted off to sleep in the boot. About an hour or so later, I awoke to the familiar sound of the car pulling off the main road. "What's up, man? Everything okay?" I asked, still half asleep. "I'm just going to fill up here," Pete replied. "You can keep sleeping. I took a couple Black Beauties and I'll be all right for the rest of the night." Black Beauties were a popular diet pill back then, and it was pretty easy to get your hands on them. It made a long trip a lot easier when you had some of those in you, but you couldn't trust any ideas you came up with since your brain was cruising at warp factor 4. "Put in $5 and I'll go inside and pay the guy," I told Pete, who was bumping his gums with Gypsy as the diet pills did their job. Gypsy turned to look at me and nodded as he got out of the car to pump the gas. It was a typical little roadside gas stop in the middle of nowhere, and I asked the guy for the bathroom key so I could take care of business before taking off again. When I came out of the toilet, the attendant said, "Hey, your buddies just drove off. Did they know you were in the restroom?" I knew Gypsy had seen me go in, and so I told him, "Yeah, they're just fooling around." After about a half an hour, I realized that somehow Pete didn't know I wasn't in the boot. I also knew that Gypsy had seen me, having looked straight at me when he got out to pump the gas. I decided to call ahead to Arlington, Virginia, to let Pete's father know where I was at, in case Pete called. I knew that he would do that once he found out I wasn't there. But since he had a full tank now and had taken the diet pills, it could be a few hours before he stopped again. The station didn't have a telephone, but the attendant told me they had one at the bar 2 miles up the road. It was already dark, so I took off walking, hoping Pete would come back soon and the attendant would tell him where I was. Now, I'm not one who is afraid of the boogeyman, but walking down a North Carolina highway in 1968 in the middle of the night, dressed like I was, all I lacked to top off my ensemble was a sign around my neck that said, "Country music sucks." I think I was whistling Dixie under my breath just for practice. I saw the lights of the bar up ahead and felt a little better. That lasted until I opened the front door and went in. 5 seconds of breathtaking silence was followed immediately by hoots, hollers, and whistles from what looked like a Hank Williams anniversary party underway. And I definitely had a feeling called the blues, but it had nothing to do with my baby saying goodbye. I thought I heard the sound of 1,000 switchblades opening at the same moment. At a time like this, you learn to improvise. I went over to the bar, trying to walk as much like John Wayne as is possible in tight bell-bottoms. I ordered a beer and asked the bartender where the payphone was. He pointed it out to me, and I walked over to it as though it was a typical night on the town. Inside, I felt like a colored waiter at a Ku Klux Klan dinner. I was thinking about how I wished I had bought those Confederate-looking jeans I had seen instead of the ones I was wearing. Oh well, no time to break weak now, I said to myself. About this time, Pete and Gypsy should have been passing through Wilson, North Carolina. Knowing that there was no real reason for them to stop, I came up with the bright idea of calling the highway patrol and giving them a description of Pete's car, hoping they would be able to stop him before he got too far and let him know that he was one passenger short. This seemed like a better plan than hanging out at Club Redneck, so I called them and said I would be waiting outside the bar if they had any news for me. Half an hour went by before a local sheriff's car pulled up into the parking lot of the saloon. I walked up and introduced myself to the deputy. He told me the State Highway Patrol was already looking for Pete, and hopefully they would catch him before he crossed over into Virginia. He took a quick look at me, then over at the guys standing in the bar doorway, and suggested that I might want to go on to Wilson with him, which is where the sheriff's office was. If we do find your friends, he said, might be better if you're still alive when they get here. I had just been thinking the same thing. About this time, and unbeknownst to me, Pete and Gypsy were already crossing the state line into Virginia. Having run out of things to talk about, Gypsy went to sleep, leaving Pete to fend for himself. Around Emporia, Virginia, he fell asleep at the wheel and skidded off the road into a ditch. It was a rather rough landing, and he hit several large holes before coming to a stop in deep grass. Reckoning it was a good time for me to drive, Pete went back to the boot and discovered I wasn't there. Since he had been driving with the top down, he assumed I had been thrown out when he ran off the road, so Pete and Gypsy got out the flashlight and started looking in the deep woods while calling out my name. The cheap batteries lasted about 5 minutes, and they spent a good part of an hour crawling around in the dark on their hands and knees, searching the roadside for my body. I guess they assumed if I was alive I would have answered. After a tiring search that probably represented the most work he had done in many years, Gypsy decided it was time to tell Pete the truth. I think I might have seen Craig get out at that last gas station in North Carolina, he told Pete. Now, Pete was a Norwegian and one of the toughest guys I've ever known. I wasn't there, but I heard later that when he got through with Gypsy, he willingly confessed that he was hoping my loss would be his gain. Gypsy had figured if I got left behind, he could take my place in the band. So much for peace, love, brotherhood, and blacklight posters. Back in Wilson, meanwhile, I had already discovered that the on-shift deputy was a guitar player himself, and after making a call to Pete's family and letting them know where I was, we sat down to pick and grin a little. Lucky for me, I knew a few country tunes, and in spite of all the cultural barriers that could have stood between us, we had a right good time. A few hours later, Pete showed up, and soon we were back on the road again. Gypsy tried to make up for his actions by saying he was depressed about the whole thing, but we dumped him off in Richmond, Virginia, and I forgot all about him until I started writing a story for you. It's fun looking back now and remembering some of those times in my life that were both exciting and hilarious. Sometimes things got a bit scary, but I learned a long time ago that if you just hold your head up and keep walking, things usually work out all right. Often the people you think should be on your side turn out to be pretty selfish, while someone else you thought was the enemy might be just another guitar player looking for a jam session. A friend of mine says we're all cut from the same cookie dough. I think he's right about that. Some of us just got baked a little too long, I guess. Life happens, and no matter how you plan yours, it still has its own surprises in store for you. I did a lot of things in mine that in hindsight I would have avoided, but who knows, maybe they were just what I had to go through in order to learn what I needed to know. Life is a lot like those interstate highways back then. Some patches are pretty well finished, but sometimes you still have to get off the main road to find out what's really going on. You never know who you're going to meet there that might be helpful in your journey. Anyway, I survived to play another song and travel another highway or two, and to this day I still don't hitchhike. Every now and then I plug one of my wife's earrings into my ear to see if the hole is still there, and sure enough, it is. I don't know if Gypsy ever found what he was seeking, and for all I know, he may have hit New York and decided to become a stockbroker or something. I wouldn't trust him with my investments, but you may feel differently about it. Pete is an archaeologist now. He still plays music and lives in the D.C. area, but refrains from road trips unless he's going to a dig. His tag and driver's license are both from the same state, though I've heard he throws an old Georgia plate in the rear window now and then just to see if anyone stops him to find out why it's there. With all the computer stuff nowadays, you couldn't get away with any of those shenanigans anyway, but old habits die hard. I went back to the gas station in Smithfield a few years ago. There's a family from India who now own it, and they all live in the back room. I shared the story of my last visit with them, but they were busy cooking curry, and the whole thing didn't seem to make any sense to them. They just shook their heads, smiled, and tried to sell me a lottery ticket. What a country. I also went back to the bar. Most of the clientele there now have longer hair than I did back in 1968. I guess all it took was Willie Nelson and Leonard Skinner to bring the South up to a more modern view of things. I skipped going to the Wilson Sheriff's Office. I figured I must have been the only person interested in the whole thing, so I just gave it up and went on about my business. I did stop at the outlet mall, though, before leaving town. I picked up a shirt with a Confederate flag on it. Just in case the South does rise again while I'm passing through North Carolina, I want to make sure I'm dressed for the occasion this time.
Well, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed our visit to the past. And since everything came out all right, I guess we're no worse for the wear. I hope you'll tell your friends about us and make sure you leave a comment. And click the RSS feed button to follow us for upcoming shows. Thanks again for riding along today, and I hope I'll see you next time for another episode of the Mules Rider Chronicles. And as we used to say back then, it was out of sight being with you today. So long.